Namaste, ladies and gentlemen. It is a great honor for me to be talking before the distinguished faculty, students, and administrators of Dhruva University. My name is Breena. I'm a professor of global strategy in the College of Business and Public Administration at California State University, San Bernardino. I'm going to address the case study method using the Socratic methodology in this talk. I'm addressing a group of experts on the case study methodology, but let me, for those that don't know about the history and the origins of the case study methodology, let me go back briefly and talk about the Socratic method of case study teaching and learning. As you know, this methodology was used by the Greek philosopher Socrates in an attempt to elicit deep learning through question and answer format from his students. This method was then more recently transferred into the legal profession by Christopher Columbus Langdell, and from there the method was transferred and taken up by the Harvard Business School for use in studying case studies that would draw light on specific aspects of management and other business concepts. Next, I'd like to talk a little bit about the andragogic method of inquiry in case study learning. Andragogic comes to us from the philosopher in education, Malcolm Knowles, who defined andragogic learning as adult learning for deep outcomes. This is as opposed to pedagogy, which is for less experienced students, maybe undergraduate students, high school students, where the instructor is basically a sage on the stage. In andragogic learning, the instructor is more the guide on the side, where the instructor forms a part of the learning environment, but it's equally important that the students, the text material, background, all play a part into learning outcomes. The andragogic method has as its key principles, adults are internally motivated and self-directed, that adults bring life experiences and knowledge to learning, that adults are goal-oriented, that adults are relevancy-oriented, that adults are practical, and that adult learners like to be respected. Just briefly, I'd like to review my experience with this methodology. Firstly, I taught it to with high-level professionals at the United States Army War College in Carlisle, here in the United States. We brought together colonels, generals, some foreign students, generals from India and other countries around the world who wanted to take a strategic studies Master of Science degree. And they were professionals from all branches of the military, the Army, Navy, Marine Corps, and Department of Defense civilians. But the guiding thing was that they were all experienced people. Some of them had PhDs, some of them were lawyers, some were doctors, some were artillerymen, they were Army or Navy policemen, different areas, but they all came together to share in learning, bringing their vast experiences into the classroom. I also used the Socratic learning method at San Diego State University, an institution from which I am now retired, and I use it today in my current position as professor of management here at the California State University in San Bernardino. I told Professor Reddy that I would, since you are a group of experts, I would just focus on a few aspects that I consider important in the case study process. These are the writing of the case study, the conditions and so forth for writing it. But very important is the pre-brief, briefing the students as to expectations and hopefully guiding them towards necessary outcomes. And the third aspect is the after-action review. Very important again, which comes out of the military sector. There's always an after-action review. And here we look at what happened, what were the outcomes, what new and exciting things came about through this little exercise of inquiry. Moving on then to the writing of the case. I'm currently writing a case study in my area of interest, which is corporate social responsibility. And so I'm going to walk us through the steps that I'm intending to take or I have already taken. There are two parts to case study writing. Obviously, the preliminary search and study, and secondly, the actual writing. Continuing with the preliminary work, the first thing one would like to do, obviously, is to brainstorm the key concepts. Here, for my case study, I would have to brainstorm the concept of CSR, corporate social responsibility, and the key concepts in strategy, and how they link together, because CSR is, of course, an organizational strategy. I knew I wanted to write up a case study about organizations that are doing well by doing good. And so that became my focus, or my little hashtag in my mind for developing the study. Then the next thing is the learning goal. How is CSR expressed in focal firms? And with that, I need to bring in learning objectives of CSR, such as conscious capitalism, corporate sustainability, shareholder value, the broader stakeholder value, the triple bottom line, people, planet, and profits, the new legal entity called the Benefit Corporation, a new legal entity in the United States. In California, it came into law in 2012. I want to address this. The B Corporation, the B Lab. The B Lab certifies B corporations based on a scale of measurable variables that they may profess to have. I want to link this with strategy concepts. Porter's 5 forces, resources and capabilities view from Barney and Hesterly, Professor Michael Ping's view of institutional considerations in strategy. I looked for 4 cases of corporations that are doing well by doing good, and I looked for them in California. And so I chose the following. There are only 3, but I felt that would be enough. The Kimpton Hotels chain, the Patagonia, the Kimpton Hotels chain, of course, is a service industry, hospitality. Patagonia is a manufacturing firm, and the Barrett Kohler firm, which is educational publishing. Moving on then to audience considerations, one would like to see whether this is a case suitable for an MBA of traditional students or an executive MBA class, a professional MBA class, or written in a way that would facilitate online learning. I also wanted to be to look at the types of case studies I could use. And there are four main types. Critical analysis and synthesis is one. Exploratory or investigative analysis is another. Cumulative examination, or descriptive and illustrative. For the benefit corporations in California, Kimpton Hotels, Patagonia, and Barrett Kayla, I decided I had to decide on a size or length. The most common length is between 25 to 30 pages. I thought I would stay within that, probably about 25 pages. The title, I like the title to describe what it is we are studying. I don't like to have ambiguous titles, so I thought the title, again, Doing Well by Doing Good, emphasizes the corporate social responsibility and the profit motive also of these benefit corporations. And then I will begin to work on setting up the introduction, and going on to the firms themselves for research and data collection and library secondary research from library sources. And an important aspect as well is the next step, of course, is the data collection. Here I want to get my first person data from the organizations, interviews if possible, surveys if not possible. Secondary data, of course, comes from the literature and from past studies. As I'm telling you earlier, that this is a new field, so it's not likely that I will find much on the benefit corporation other than the enabling legislation that got these corporations into their present form. The previous slide showed the sectional mapping of the case study. And so to begin with, the introduction, which sets the stage for both the concept of CSR, the enabling legislation, and the strategic concepts that are going to be brought forth, as well as very briefly what has happened, what kind of findings have occurred, just a brief, in fact, just a brief review in the introduction of all the elements of this case study would be appropriate. The next would be the background, looking at the research, looking at what went on. All of you know about that, doing a literature review. And the next element, of course, is presentation of the data. You would like to present your research, your findings, the analysis of the research, synthesis of the research, graphs, percentages, and so forth, all the data that you have received. After the data presentation, you want to evaluate the findings. Does the analysis support your original question or perspective or the issue presented in the introduction? What similarities are there regarding current thinking on corporate social responsibility? What dissimilarities? What unintended findings emerged from this study? And finally, you write your conclusion. You would briefly summarize the findings from the focal firms that already you have done in the data analysis and the evaluation of findings. So just briefly show how the learning objectives for CSR and strategy were set forth in the case study originally were met in this study. So, and finally, you'd want to create at least 4 provocative questions. These are the type of questions that require analytical thinking. Ask the groups themselves if they would develop a fifth question that they feel should be asked. And so that would make the body of questions, about 5 questions. 4 that you develop as the case study developer, and 1 that's to be developed by the groups and then answered by them. I'm going to move on now to the pre-brief. This is the actual brief before the groups get on to their work on doing the case study. Obviously, in the pre-brief, we create performance groups and remind them that they'll be going through stages of group formation, which would be the forming, storming, there's going to be some conflicts, norming, finally creating some workable standards or rules or norms for the group, and finally performing as a full-fledged performance group. Critical issues also for the pre-brief is we just talked about that, group norms, but also the having the group look at what and decide what is the situation. What is the situational imperative here? What questions do we have? Problems. What problems here need to be solved? Solutions. What are some of the solutions that come to mind as we do our preliminary reading? Evaluation of costs and benefits, pros and cons of underlying assumptions of the strategies. Information. What possible information can you elicit? What more do you need? And then the group roles. The facilitator and the groups will decide who does what, who is responsible for what aspect of the case study. The facilitator, otherwise known as the instructor, would also suggest some group requirements for the case discussion. One of them is active listening, letting others finish, trying to paraphrase main points to make sure meaning is transmitted accurately. Ask the groups to keep an open mind, value opposing ideas. Participation is very important. I always tell my students, when they're in the room, they're in the game. And finally, stay on focus. Don't be bringing forth a lot of red herrings and moving the group out of its focus. Remind your participants of what disruptive behavior looks like. Interrupting is one of them. Negative body language. Sidebars and whispering to each other. Making comments like, that won't work. That's wrong. That makes no sense. Acting as if you know the whole truth, the whole information. A lack of humility, okay? Saying things like, that's not practical. And you can think of others. We move on now to the after-action review, again very briefly. The after-action review takes place after everything is done. The questions have been answered, and the case has been presented. We want to see how we did. And it begins with an articulation of the consequences that came out and findings. What were the expected consequences? And more importantly, what new and exciting discoveries came out as a result of this exercise? After-action reviews, in the formal sense, were and are used by the military. The use has been extended to business as a knowledge management tool, as a way to build a culture of accountability for whatever action has taken place. And it's a structured review for analyzing what has happened, why it happened, and how it can be done better. Moving on to advantages of the case study methodology. Active listening and learning. The case study method engages learners in active learning by putting them squarely in the shoes of real corporations, with the leaders and employees wrestling with real dilemmas. And another advantage we mentioned before was the dynamic interaction between the students who engage in the presentation, the lively debate, and ad hoc role plays as they may emerge. Some disadvantages of the case study methodology might be that the content might become outdated, although old cases still provide learning opportunities. We go back to uh, old cases to renew our knowledge. And so what you might do is, if it's an old case, bring your group up to speed as to what is happening. But at the outset, tell them that this is a learning opportunity. Bias, there could be a bias in the case writer's choosing of the case. Overgeneralization from the case, okay? Making the case an end in itself rather than a learning opportunity for the two areas, or in this case, corporate social responsibility, the strategic studies, and within which we studied then the three benefit corporations. Another disadvantage is, of course, losing the line of sight. The story might be so exciting in and of itself, students lose sight of the linkage to learning outcomes. And finally, I have to tell myself boring writing should be overcome by the facilitator. If the case has salience to learning, the facilitator can try to overcome the boringness of the writing. I would like to end with this quote from the British military historian J.C. Fuller about the method of teaching and learning, of group learning. And this is what he said. And in the War College, we had this credo in all of our seminar rooms. We shall teach each other, first, because we have a vast amount of experience behind us. And secondly, in my opinion, it is only through the free criticism of each other's ideas that truth can be trashed out. No one is going to compel you to work, for the simple reason that a man who requires to be driven is not worth the driving. Thus you will learn to teach yourselves. You will never be taught by others. And finally, to the audience, Dhanyavad. Thank you so much for listening to this presentation. I'm honored to be here.